Hail, fellow Achaean! The glorious day has finally arrived, the end of the Trojan War. But our work here is far from done, my friend. For now that we have gotten the best of the Trojans, we must get the better of the mess that we left behind. Oh, don't give me that look. This war waged on for 10 years. Did you expect to just pray to Poseidon and he'd wash all this away? Perhaps you're just homesick. If you're that eager to leave, I hear Odysseus, very clever man, makes plans to set sail home for Ithaca at first light tomorrow. If you're lucky, perhaps you could join his crew. I'm sure he won't make much of an odyssey out of it. I'm sorry, that was terrible, I know, but I had my fun. Hi, I'm Hunter Rose, and welcome to Rose Reads. You've probably guessed that today's topic is going to be about two of the oldest classics known to man, Homer's The Iliad and The Odyssey. Before we go any further, I'd like to disclaim that this is not an English class or a storytime video, so I'm not going to outright give you the story or go over the subtle meanings an author might have had with their work. All I want to do is let you know if the story is worth your time, your interest, and what edition you might want to aim for. Now, I know you should never judge a book by its cover, but let's take a look at the edition that I have and see if it's one you might want to pick up. This is Barnes & Noble's collectible edition of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And while the quality of the material used here is actually very good, and it does make you feel like you're holding a piece of history in your hands, I can't really advocate going out of the way to get this edition on the way it looks. When you want to get a nice book, you want it to stand out on a shelf or really anywhere you place it. The color scheme and design of this one is so bland that it's just going to blend in to wherever you put it. I don't think I would leave this on a coffee table in fear that someone might accidentally use it as a coaster. So you're not getting this book for the way it looks. The only reason you get this edition is because you want a convenient way to get your hands on both the Iliad and the Odyssey in one convenient package. Without further ado, let's discuss the Iliad. First, what exactly does the word Iliad actually mean? I gotta confess, after reading that book start to finish, I was a bit confused why it had that title myself. But just like Odyssey is one word that means a long journey or travel, Iliad is one word that means a series of unfortunate events. Given the context of both stories, they're very appropriately titled. So what is the story of the Iliad? Well, if you go out right now and ask the first person you see, I guarantee you'll get one of two answers. The first is, I don't know, I don't even know who you are, get away from me. The second is, oh yeah, that's the story about the Trojan War. Well, surprisingly, that second answer is only partially correct. Now, hold on, I know you're thinking, the Iliad is the most famous story about the Trojan War. How could that be wrong? Well, as it turns out, the Iliad only really covers about half of the Trojan War. As far as both the books are concerned, you never actually see the end of the conflict. It's almost like there's a missing book, like this was meant to be a trilogy, and one book was the end, and the Iliad was the beginning, and the Odyssey is the aftermath. But that mystery is beyond me. Oh, and before I forget, the famous Trojan horse, not featured in this story. Disappointing, I know. It's the Trojan War and you don't get to see the big wooden horse. If you want more details on that, you're gonna have to get them from a history book, I'm afraid. Let's talk about the Iliad's three main perspectives. The first is the protagonists, the Akians. They're an alliance assembled from Greek all-stars like Achilles, Agamemnon, Menculus, Odysseus, Patroclus, the Ajaxes, Diomed, all of which are Grecian royalty or demigods in their own respect. And these guys are like certified super soldiers. Each one of these main characters are probably worth maybe 5 of the Trojans. I mean, even when the Trojans are getting their upper hand, you can't help but feel bad that they have to face these guys. The second perspective is obviously the antagonists. the Trojans, more specifically their MVP, Hector, the Prince of Troy. He's just about the best that Troy has, and his side of the story is how he's desperately trying to lead his people to victory against this threat. And like I said, you can't help but feel bad for the guy. The third perspective is the gods of Mount Olympus. I gotta say, I'm not a big fan of their part of the story. The best analogy I can come up with for their parts is that they're like a family that's gathered for Thanksgiving that's watching the football game. But one half of the family is rooting for one side, and the other half's rooting for the other. The only difference is that this family actively rigs the game in their team's favor. It gets to the point where you just want them to back off for a second and just let the humans sort things out. Just let them fight, guys. They probably have this handled. But I digress. So, what started the Trojan War? You're probably thinking Helen of Troy, the girl whose beauty inspired armadas and armies to assemble and caused the deaths of hundreds of people. That is still the case, but in the context of this story, it's actually Achilles himself that starts this conflict. You see, the tale begins before the Trojan War when King Achilles and King Agamemnon have a dispute. This dispute ends in Agamemnon taking one of Achilles' wives. Achilles doesn't like that one bit, so he prays to the gods to make Agamemnon suffer. And thus, the Trojan War begins, where Agamemnon's sister-in-law, Helen, is taken away, so he assembles the Akians together to go get her back. Achilles is actually part of the Akians, but he abstains from fighting because, well, this is what he wanted Agamemnon to go through. He wants him to suffer. And it's this reluctance to fight that causes a great deal of misery to the Akians and himself. So what is the Iliad's greatest strength? Well, the thing about stories about war is that they can have many different tones. It can be written so that a war can be viewed as tragic, epic, terrifying, sometimes even beautiful, but almost always chaotic. If written poorly, stories about war can be all over the place. It can be hard to keep track of what's going on. But the Iliad, despite its age, reads just like a first-hand report of how the war went down. It's so detailed and orthodox that you'll almost never lose your place. Every single soldier has a name, and it goes into gruesome detail on how each one meets their end. We're talking decapitations, impalement, embowelment, and more severed limbs than you can shake someone's leg at. If you think those thoughts will make you queasy, you probably want to pass on the Iliad. It's one of the most graphic stories I have ever read. So, another question you might wonder is, do you need to read the Iliad to understand and appreciate the Odyssey? Well, the answer is no. There's such a big gap of time between the two that each one can be taken and enjoyed as its own standalone story, and you don't really need to know the one to appreciate the other. The only instance I can remember is in the Odyssey. There's one chapter that's meant for fans of the Iliad especially. It's where Odysseus ventures into the underworld. I'm going to give you a multiple choice. What do you think happens? Does Odysseus A, make a deal with Hades, the god of death? Does he B, face off against the giant three-headed dog Cerberus? Or does he C, reunite with a bunch of old characters from the Iliad as a fan service to those who read that book? It's C. Honestly, you probably won't appreciate that chapter unless you read that story, but it doesn't really do any harm. And if you're a Hercules fan, you'll probably be happy to hear that even he makes a cameo in that chapter. So, what do I recommend you do about the Iliad? If you feel like you want to absolutely read both of Homer's classics in one fell swoop, I say go for it. But I myself would actually suggest maybe saving the Iliad. The Iliad is a great war story and it can be taken on its own. And so I would say if you're ever thinking that you crave For your next book to be a great, detailed story about war, give the Iliad your consideration. It may be old, but it's one of the best. Now let's discuss the Iliad's more popular sequel story, The Odyssey. As you probably figure, The Odyssey focuses solely on the character of Odysseus as he tries to make his way home after the Trojan War. And you might be like most of the Akians in thinking you'd want to get home as quickly as possible after 10 years of fighting. Odysseus didn't share this mindset though. He believed that since they were out here anyway, that they would take their time to explore the exotic islands, sample the cuisine, and say hello to the locals. Unfortunately, these islands were ruled by gods and monsters, the cuisine was highly addictive psychedelics, and the locals were crazy cannibals. And that's only scratching the surface of what these guys have to go through. They have to sail treacherous storms, get captured by a cyclops, do battle with sirens and sea monsters, and even get affected by witchcraft and sorcery, all of which gets them lost at sea for another 10 years after the war. So as you can tell, this is a tried and true adventure story of epic proportion. So what makes the Odyssey special? What sets it apart from other fantasies and myths? In my opinion, that's gotta be the amount of variety and creativity used in this story. By all means, this should be an incomprehensible mess of a myth. There's so much going on, and yet it's so well paced and structured that it never has you asking for less. It only ever has you begging for more. You see, each new location, threat, and creature can never be handled the exact same way twice. And Odysseus was never known as one of the strongest Akians. He was known as one of the most clever. So if he and his crew want to survive this high sea adventure, they really need to think outside of the box. And that is something that you have to appreciate. So that's the Odyssey's greatest strength. Does it have any glaring weaknesses? Well, the most notable I can think of is the fact that there simply isn't enough of it. And unfortunately, I'm not referring to the length of the book. You might want to brace yourself because as it turns out, the actual Odyssey part of this story is half of the narrative. I know that sounds strange, so I'll try to explain. You see, Odysseus is the king of his homeland Ithaca, and for all these 2 decades, his people have been without a leader. So all these guys have been making moves on his wife in hopes of becoming the next king. She doesn't respond well to their advances, however, as she firmly believes that her husband is alive and well and making his way back home. This doesn't stop the suitors from helping themselves to Odysseus's property, his food, his servants, all the while still making advances on his wife. Things get so out of hand that Odysseus's son, Telemachus, decides once and for all to go out and find out if his father really is alive or dead. So after Odysseus's initial journey, he and his son do reunite, and the rest of the story is them conspiring to exact revenge on these suitors in the most dramatic fashion possible. Maybe these aren't story details I should be revealing, but I don't want you to feel like I've misled you with, promises of a great adventure when the later half does turn into a revenge drama. For what it's worth, this last bit is still entertaining, and the initial adventure alone makes this book worth a read. Now, I won't say this about every single book I talk about, but I do believe that the Odyssey is worth your time. If you read it for school and only loosely remember the details, or if you never read it in the first place, the Odyssey is a classic that genuinely entertains and satisfies. This isn't some stuffy, high-collar English novel or a grounded tale of living it rough on the frontier. It's Greek mythology. It's magic and monsters and adventure on the open sea. It's got a little something that anyone can pick up and appreciate. Thank you so much for listening in. I can't wait for our next discussion. And hey, let me know what you think in the comments below. Are Homer's classics books that'll interest you? And if you have read these stories, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, I'd better get going. If I miss the next ship, I'm going to be in a doozy of an odyssey myself. but I'll see you next time.